Hi, I'm Ray Capice, Practice Lead Science and Technology Grants with Lowfeld Consulting Group. I'm here to talk about winning government grants, which can be beneficial to small, mid-size, or large firms. Up until recently, I worked for more than 15 years on competitive FAR Part 15 type proposals, multiple award contracts, GWACs, small, 8A, to large for dozens of different clients, bidding projects for a dozen different government agencies. Recently, I've become totally invested in grants, which I see as a largely overlooked area of opportunities in our space for government contractors. First, some ABCs of government grants. A is for alternative. For those in the contracting space, government grants should be viewed as an adjunct to the contracting business that's your bread and butter. But adding grants to your toolbox can supplement and help grow your business. B is for big. The amounts of funding set aside for government grants has grown tremendously over the past decade. Today, there are over 900 grant programs offered by 26 federal grant-making agencies. C is for caveats. Federal grants may include additional requirements or restrictions not normally encountered in the course of normal contracting. More on that in a bit. So to contrast grants and proposals, think of contracts as business agreements where the government pays for a specific service or product, while grants can be thought of as investments in projects the government funds in hopes of yielding a specific outcome. Though it's always been said that hope isn't a strategy, it is a term appropriate for research grants if you're working to invent something or to cure a disease. But of course, the government expects that large investments in ongoing businesses will provide a payback benefiting the nation on some level. And grant programs can be very lucrative, offering direct funding, loans, or loan guarantees, or a combination of the three. Looking at the grants awarded by a cross-section of agencies last year alone, the numbers are staggering. According to the Government Accounting Office, for fiscal 2023, 143,468 grants were awarded, totaling $1.63 trillion. Of course, that's for all federal assistance. Federal spending is designated into broad purpose categories called budget functions. And the top 5 purposes over 2022 and 2023 are community and regional development, natural resources and environment, transportation, national defense, and health. These are all in the billions of dollars of range. And this is from the GAO's Tracking the Funds site. The information is all public, and a number of databases are online, including usaspending.gov, which lets you search and download award data, sam.gov, grants.gov, and the agency sites themselves. A key point for this audience is that grants are offered by nearly every agency, which provides a good starting point for research. If you've performed on contracts for, say, Health and Human Services, I'd recommend exploring their grant programs if you haven't already done so. Likewise, for Veterans Administration, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Transportation, and so on, they all likely have a grants program, and they're probably large. This data will hopefully convince you to move yourself or your management past perceptions about grants. They're not just for nonprofits and universities. After so many years working on federal contracts, I had to do that myself. But for me, it was the technical connection that led me to grants. My efforts and those of the firms I've worked for in the federal contracting space have been focused on technical proposals. I'm an engineer, the opportunity to work with super smart subject matter experts on bleeding edge contracts such as the Joint Warfighter Cloud capability presented fascinating challenges. Just how do you move zettabytes from one cloud to another? It was an opportunity to see what Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Oracle had under the hood. Likewise, NASA bids were fascinating. They always are. Here's the Mars 2020 mission Perseverance rover launch. I mean, what could be more exciting than working on the SPIX program? I also had the opportunity to work on next generation nuclear reactors, which I personally believe will be a big part of our solution to the energy problem. But the grant program that changed everything for me, the epiphany, was the Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors and Science Act of 2022. Better known as the CHIPS Act. If you followed its rapid trajectory, Biden's CHIPS Act is all about bringing the semiconductor manufacturing back to the U.S. It became law after flying through both houses of Congress with bipartisan support because everyone realized it would be good, if not necessary, for the country. I believe the CHIPS program and its derivative and companion programs have something in the way of grants to offer everyone on this call. The CHIPS Act will direct more than $280 billion over the next 10 years. And while its technology programs are far-reaching, from manufacturing to R&D to supply chain, digital twinning, and others, it mandates a wide range of wraparound services, including childcare, education and training, disadvantaged community support, and others. I'll discuss later how you might participate in these programs. Admittedly, my interest in chips is more than casual. I have a background in semiconductors. I was a co-founder of Lattice Semiconductor, maker of programmable logic, back in the 80s. Today, the company has revenue of over $700 million and a market cap of $10 billion. I also worked briefly for Cree before it became Wolfspeed, as a leader in silicon carbide technology. But I was also deeply motivated personally to be part of CHIPS. The U.S. was getting crushed by Far East chip production. I hadn't realized how badly. Ironically, 40 years ago, Lattice was applauded for our fabless strategy, but we had no expectation that today fewer than 12% of the world's semiconductors would be made in the U.S. Chips for America set out aggressively to change that. This is McKinsey's map of the CHIPS Act. It has many piece parts. It's very confusing. But making my way through the complexity of the CHIPS Act opportunities was also my introduction to the complicated world of technology grants. My first CHIPS effort was on behalf of Arizona State University, which was preparing to bid on a relatively small initial program, the opportunity to serve as a technology hub for prototyping chips in the US. If you look back at the McKinsey map, it's that tiny little 2.0 with the circle around it, which was really just one tiny piece of the overall program. It's dwarfed by the $200 billion chunk in the center to be appropriated for NSF, Department of Energy, and the Department of Commerce that's been making the news this year. The grant process was anything but straightforward. Prototyping hub portion was being administered by a consortium manager, NSTXL, the National Security Technology Accelerator. The team that brought me in said NSTXL would manage the grant as an OTA. Did I know what an OTA was? Of course, I said. So I immediately began Googling and ended up with the Office of Tenant Advocate and the Orthopedic Trauma Association, so that wasn't it. This whole thing was completely alien to me. But I learned quickly about OTAs. Other transaction agreements or other transaction authority, let's call them OTs, are legally binding instruments that may be used to engage industry and academia for a broad range of research and prototyping activities. They are not standard procurement contracts, grants, or cooperative agreements. As such, they're generally not subject to the federal laws and regulations that apply to government procurement contracts, such as those that fall under FAR regulations or Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations, DFARS. OTs were developed to speed the acquisition process. According to NSTXL, its OTs average a submission to award timeline just over 100 days. Compare that to the 12 to 24 months or more with traditional defense contracts. The lion's share of the CHIPS funding became to be awarded by the Department of Commerce and as a different vehicle. This one is called a NOFO, and it offered incentives coming in three forms. Direct funding, which is the grant, actual cash grant for the company. Loans, which are direct loans from the federal government at an attractive rate. And then loan guarantees, federal guarantees for third-party loans to be applicant for eligible costs, which can be useful for equipment leases and so on. The CHIPS Act will appropriate $50 billion over the next 5 years. So of that $280 billion, $50 billion is on its way to being made available. Lofeld rolled with the program, and now we're currently working on a multi-$100 million NOFO. To date, the Department of Commerce's first NOFO was for commercial fabrication facilities, the chip fabs, which has led the news this year. There have been upwards of 400 applications submitted for funding. But as of this writing, the Commerce Department has made just 4 awards. These are BAE for $35 million, Microchip Technology at $162 million, Global Foundries, one of the largest foundries, of $1.5 billion, and just last month, Intel Corporation received an award of $8.5 billion. The Commerce Department is not even slowing down. They've got 2 additional NOFOs in the pipeline, small-scale supplier projects, and then a packaging program and materials with concept papers due later this month and full applications in July. So these things are moving along quite rapidly. So the opportunity, I've dwelled on chips quite a bit, but the opportunity, if you're not in the semiconductor R&D materials or related business, is still available to everyone to participate as a partner. Since entities are interested in supporting the CHIPS Act but are not eligible to apply on their own, the Department of Commerce is making it easier to facilitate partnerships and collaboration that can advance the national security interests. There are mandates within the CHIPS Act, as you'll see in a number of government grant programs, that include educational and workforce training, childcare, support for minority-owned women and veteran-owned businesses, community-based organizations, labor unions, and others. These might present an opportunity for your business. So it's not just all about creating semiconductor fabs. There's a lot of related support, and you can sign up for these on chips.gov and join as a teaming partner on chips.gov. So where do you find other grant opportunities? Other than CHIPS, where do we start looking? I had mentioned earlier NSTXL, which is on the more technical side, is really OT central, meaning it's got dozens and dozens of prototype and R&D opportunities across 2 areas, primarily microelectronics, which they call their SMARTS Consortium, and Space Enterprise Consortium called SPEC. These are on the site nstl.org. You can view these, and they also have partnering opportunities for you to review. If you're a subscriber to GovWin, you can check there. GovWin does track some OTAs, but details are usually limited to the consortiums that they're released on, such as NSTXL. It does not track federal grants, but GovWin does provide alerts for the state, local, and education, so-called SLED markets. But absolutely worth mentioning is grants.gov. It's an unpretentious site that's extremely well put together and has an extraordinary search capability. You can search on forecasted, posted, closed, archived grants. You can search by agency, and it offers blogs, information on blog posts for additional support. You can set alerts, and it's free to sign on to. So at Lowfell, we're in it for the long run. I've satisfied myself, and we've satisfied ourselves, that there's enough opportunity outside FAR contracts to keep most companies busy in the grant space. And I haven't even mentioned loan programs, which we are also participating in several of federal loan programs. I'll wrap up with some final thoughts on proposals versus grants. Looking at them side by side can be insightful. On the plus side, grants can be less competitive and lower risk, and more flexible, and offer certain advantages, such as the ability to own your intellectual property that's developed onto that program. On the flip side, grants may not have option years for additional work that would require new applications, and they may tack on indirectly related requirements, such as the wraparound services that I mentioned earlier that CHIPS requires. To be sure, grants are not free money. They have a lot of additional requirements and additional monitoring often. They require dedicated resources within your company. And as I mentioned earlier, they will often tack on these additional services that might require experts for you to contract with, who understand that particular space, such as sectoral partnerships and working with disadvantaged communities and so on. So do your homework. Research nstxl.org and GovWin. Sign up at grants.gov. Add your firm to the CHIPS team partner list. It can't hurt. And if you provide any services that are ancillary or adjunct to what is required in the CHIPS program, you could be contacted by one of their direct applicants. You should be prepared to dedicate resources, just as you would with capture management. And if a grant opportunity emerges that matches your company's skills and experience, but has additional requirements that don't match your skills, consider a consulting firm that specializes in these, such as I mentioned, community support, sectoral partnerships, and other things that are not in the usual contacting space for your company. Lastly, for proposal writers or managers in the audience, there's a somewhat parallel world to APMP and proposals. It's the Grant Professionals Association. You can check that out at grantprofessionals.org. In any event, please feel free to contact me at Lofeld Consulting. We're also going to be at BPC New Orleans in June. I will be on a panel breaking into the U.S. government bidding cycle on day 2, or you can stop by our exhibitor table. We're always on the lookout for writing talent, particularly folks with technical backgrounds, physicists, engineers, computer scientists. So thanks everyone for listening. To get a copy of these slides, just email us at Lofeld Consulting. We're now going to switch to a live mode to entertain a few questions.
Thanks so much for all of that great information, Ray. I learned a lot, and I know our participants did as well. So here are some Q&A questions we received from our audience. First one, how are the challenges presented by technology and manufacturing grants different compared to more general types of grants?
Well, the grants that we at Lofeld have been supporting aim at advancing state-of-the-art, as opposed to, say, grants that provide aid or improve education. So grants, for example, for the Microelectronics Commons or CHIPS, but these are federal programs designed to improve the U.S. competitive performance on a global stage. So what makes them especially challenging is that they're often tied to benchmarks that push the technology envelope to achieve, for example, a certain node, which is the size of transistors for a chip factory, such as when we hear that Apple Computer has contracted for nearly all of TSMC's 3 nanometer node capacity in Taiwan. There's none available in the US. That's a problem. So commercial competitiveness really underlies a lot of the federal grant objectives. But I need to point out also that in many cases, national defense is a part of the equation. So if it turns out that technology and manufacturing grants can be both considered literally and figuratively a space race, there's a need to make sure that we are competing well on the global stage.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What specific strategies or examples can be provided to illustrate successful community engagement and support building efforts that have contributed to winning these types of grants?
Okay, that's one of the most challenging parts, especially for a technology company that may not have considered these requirements, and they're found in so many of the federal grant and loan programs. So the CHIPS Act specifically, for example, requires community engagement. You have to demonstrate this. You have to demonstrate that you've got a strategy in place to remove barriers for economically disadvantaged individuals and other underrepresented sectors in STEM careers. As one example, we have a client that's aiming for a full gamut of engagement programs, which is a great example. They're setting aside funds that range from scholarships for K through 12 and STEM curriculum development to veteran success centers. So, but not all companies have to be providing something that's so extensive or expensive. There are other examples, creative examples that can be high profile, especially if they're picked up in the media and social media included. Things like International Women in Engineering Day. These will often get followed on stories. We just had on March 14th a number of Pi Day events. Engineers have made March 14th special since 3.14, as every child knows, is pi in geometry. And there are activities that could be considered usual practice in technology companies, such as participating in job fairs, actively monitoring and updating campus job boards that may also help satisfy the grant requirements. I think what's key for this is making sure that you have committed departments or members of your organization who are dedicated to working in these programs, which, since they often take time, they involve a lot of interaction with state and local committees that move slowly through their decision-making processes. And really the best advice is to make sure that these things are underway before applying for funding, so that everything is just not just a promise to do something in your grant application. The federal government expects to see real programs and activity, understandably, since they provide the applicant companies a return in the form of workforce development, even without federal funding. So not just window dressing to win an award.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Can you detail the most common pitfalls or mistakes organizations make when applying for government-funded grants in technology and manufacturing, and how to avoid those mistakes?
Well, there are a number of mistakes in really all kinds of grants that you want to go through a list of very specific approaches in your strategy for putting the grant together. Probably the most important is make sure you're applying for the right grant, that you've got your target technologies and you're addressing the regional needs and so on. So you really just have to do a lot of research right up front. Make sure that the grant is in alignment with your company's goals. Probably number two is make sure your proposal is clear and doesn't have unrealistic guidelines for it. So make sure it's concise, that it concisely addresses the grant's stated criteria, and you have a very clear understanding of the scope and timeline and budget and so on. Another common mistake in the technology ones that we've seen is that they're really focused on technology and they don't do a good job of explaining the broader societal and economic impact, things like the sectoral partnerships and so on that are required in a lot of these grants. So you have to highlight the project's potential to create jobs or improve efficiency or solve a specific problem, and you have to be as quantitative as possible when you do this. The qualifications of your team, not less of a problem, but make sure that those are stated strongly, and the relevance of your team to do the work is made clear in your grant. And lastly, make sure you put together a solid presentation. So we basically say you three things. You start early on these things because there's a lot of moving parts in them. You should seek some guidance from grant writing professionals such as some Lofeld Consulting, but there are several other organizations that may be more familiar with a specific grant program. And then make sure you're doing the necessary networking in the region or the state and local area that your funding is going to be applicable to.
Okay, thank you. Sounds a lot like proposals.
Yeah.
All right. How do the tone and formality of grant writing and proposal writing differ?
Well, tone and style-wise, both should be written as specifically and economically as possible. Describing the applicant's experience and the work to be undertaken. But by the nature of the difference between proposals and grants, the responses will differ. In proposals, as I stated earlier, the contractor is signing up to execute a statement of work or performance work statement, a SOW or PWS, with clearly defined deliverables and milestones. You're delivering on what you're getting paid for. They also usually follow a defined process, although the process has been changing in recent years, including a lot of scorecard proposals and use of oral presentations and real-time assignments and so on. They generally follow a defined process. Writing grants, on the other hand, the applicants usually focus on the goals and specifics of a project and how the funds will be applied. So that's really a different nature. If you're trying to create to do some inventing or working on research, certainly research grants fall in this category, then there's a great emphasis on the qualifications of the team. Sometimes it's down to an individual on your team who has a track record. That's not something you would normally see in a proposal. So the awarding organization, a grant awarding organization, is really betting on the success of your team or individuals on your team, rather than providing a contract to do specific work.
Thank you. Last question. What is different about the way a grant review board reviews a grant and a source selection evaluation board reviews a proposal?
Well, in proposal, the source selection committee obviously is under pressure to make it as objective an evaluation as possible. The committee will try best to rigorously follow the evaluation criteria in a proposal. It's often called Section M in an RFP, and they'll rigorously score the responses. This is all spelled out in the government FAR regulations. And this is why at Lofeld Consulting, we're constantly reminded to design a proposal to be scored, not read. Bob Lofeld's best-selling 10 Steps to Creating High-Scoring Proposals book, which is my Bible, states that what should be obvious but is often overlooked. Things like make it easy for the evaluator to score and audit, make your strengths pop off the page, include explicit strength and benefit criteria, etc. This is really what we live by here. The evaluations of grants may have less objectivity than proposals, and often the text in the government's requirements document is less specific than in proposals. It may be minimal. It may vaguely reference other parts of the document, which was what we found to be the case with CHIPS applications, the CHIPS program, since it has both evaluation criteria and program priorities, and you needed to address both of those sections. So, but it was interesting that for the CHIPS evaluation, we had some feedback that the Department of Commerce was actually using the conventional FAR approach to scoring strengths and weaknesses, even using the same color scheme that the FAR recommends, from red, which is unacceptable, to blue, which is outstanding. So they're not all that different in that regard. Make sure your strengths are emphasized and you're giving the evaluators what they want.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for joining us today, Ray. Really appreciate all your hard work preparing for this webinar and your terrific answers. And we'll be following up on any questions that you weren't able to answer today in upcoming blog posts. Great. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.